Welcome to our Black History Month event, following the trowel, African Lives in Tower Hamlets with Dr. Montaz Marché. I'm Genova Messiah. I'm one of the Learning Engagement and Learning Officers at Tower Hamlets Local History Library and Archives. We're based on Bancroft Road. We collect, preserve and make accessible records that document the history of Tower Hamlets. If you have any questions about our service or the collections we hold, you can visit our website. I will post our website in the chat a little bit later. So our talk today will be delivered by Dr. Montaz. Recently completed her PhD in early modern Black lives in London, specifically Black women, and we have worked closely with Montaz on the Communities of Liberation project, which is a long-term project uncovering the stories of people of African heritage living in Tower Hamlets who were considered working class, that lived ordinary lives, or those that had liberated themselves from enslavement between the years 1572 and 1802 with the building of the West India Docks. Dr. Montaz delivered this talk back in April for the closing event of the Communities of Liberation exhibition. So we're so glad to have her back to deliver the talk again online. So we're looking forward to it immensely. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Montaz. So thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Nova, for introducing me, and thank you so much to the Tower Hamlets Archive team for the invitation to do this talk. But in any case, today I really wanted to I also want to have a bit of a shout out to and an acknowledgement and a big thank you to everyone who is involved in the Communities of Liberation project. That goes from the kind of steering committee members right the way to the incredible co-producers who work so hard putting together the exhibition that we had in March. And because a lot of what I'm about to talk about today is a result of that work and a result of that collaboration. And so it's really exciting to kind of be able to chat with you today. And so the wider project with the Communities of Liberation, whilst there was an incredible exhibition in March that kind of highlighted a few historical subjects, we uncovered nearly 1,000 individuals of African heritage who lived, resided, or engaged with the geographies of Tower Hamlets across the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. That was so many lives, and an exhibition can only sort of cater to so many. So I want to expand on that focus outwardly from the lives in the exhibition to the lives that were dispersed across the memories of Tower Hamlets, using parish records, newspaper records, criminal publications, and more. I want to take this opportunity to imagine a little and briefly recall and expand upon what is known about some of the African individuals who made their lives for themselves in Tower Hamlets, and who perhaps, if we were walking through Tower Hamlets at any given time between 1567 and 1802, we may have encountered or gauged out of the corner of our eyes. And so the person I want to begin with is Sabina. So, like many others whose stories and knowledge are only known out of a single fragment in the archive, Sabina's story stems around, or our knowledge of Sabina's story stems around a runaway advertisement from the Daily Advertiser on the 17th of June, 1743. In the advertisement, she was said to have fled from the ship Hannah, which was captained by Fowler, whose first name was likely John, and the son of Captain John Fowler Sr., who had previously sailed ships across the Middle Passage from the early 1700s. She was said to have fled on the 6th of June, 1743, which was 11 days before the advertisement was published. And whilst she is recorded alone, it's actually a tragic but common story of flight in Tower Hamlets and across Britain. For even the day before this advertisement, even the day before her flight, a young man from Bermuda called Jack fled from the ship Charming Molly, likely in the regions of Wapping or Shadwell, or perhaps a little further afield from Billingsgate. So it shows that this is something that's quite common. At the time, Sabina's runaway advertisement was published with a sense of urgency, stating that on top of the 3 guinea reward that would have been earned for someone bringing Sabina to Mr. Neal's at Poultry Hill, there would be another 10 shillings more if there were to have her on the ship to Hannah again by next Tuesday, the 25th of June, when the ship would likely sail. Had the situation been reversed and Sabina had stayed on the ship, as many others undoubtedly had done in the past, Sabina would have likely spent a month on that ship or in captivity, or in the captivity of Captain Fowler, contemplating her future. That future may have involved a trip to the West African coast, where ships from London typically went to begin their Middle Passage journey, collecting kidnapped Africans and displacing them to the Caribbean or the Americas. For the ship Hannah, the logs show that in the years prior, it had taken trips to the Gold Coast and Benin before heading to Jamaica or Barbados or Nevis, all of which were slave societies. From this, it's clear, without explicit reference in the advertisements themselves, that the ship Hannah was a slave ship, and Sabina was likely to have been sent back to the Caribbean to be enslaved there. But that was not to be, for she fled from the ship Hannah and was supported by, and I quote, some other black, an experience that I will return to in a moment. More than this, Sabina's flight, as we know it, was successful, for 2 months later, another runaway advertisement for Sabina was published in the Daily Advertiser on the 14th of September. The second advertisement echoed the first, except for one detail, the request to have Sabina on the ship before the 25th of June, 1743. Clearly, Sabina had missed the ship and saved herself a future of captivity. Sabina's life and essence have also been reduced to descriptors in this advertisement. She's described as 19 years old, with 2 letters on her breast and shoulder. These markers of ownership are branded into the skin, usually with pieces of silver wire or small irons fashioned into the initials of a merchant for the purposes of commodification and dehumanization. And they remain not only as a physical identifier as used in the advertisement, but as a physical reminder of her recent or historic experiences of enslavement. Finally, what the runaway advertisement indicates is that Sabina was deluded away, supposedly, by a Blackabout, Whitechapel, Rags Fair, or Rotherhithe. 2 out of 3 of those places are in Tower Hamlets. This advertisement indicates so much when we read between the lines. We can see an act of liberation, an act of bravery, an act of incredible risk, both in the pursuit of freedom, but also in what came afterwards. For freedom also exposed Sabina to the dangers, the challenges, as well as the liberties of London streets. Still, the question remains, where were her destinations? Were these her destinations? And if so, why run further into Tower Hamlets? Why was Whitechapel or Rags Fair a possible point of destination for liberated Africans like Sabina? For Sabina actually wasn't the only one to flee in this direction. Christmas Bennett, a black woman servant who ran from Mr. Guilford's in Brunswick Row, also said to have been concealed somewhere in Whitechapel. And this advertisement was listed only 5 years later, on the 25th of February, 1748. Now, there are some things about Tower Hamlets that likely drew in populations from all across the country. Its central point of trade and industry made it a beacon for working people and for those of lower economic status. It was an industrial centre for London, the home of the Pool of London, with major industries including shipping, clothing, and weaving, making it ideal for someone who wanted to begin a new life and find work. But there's one of the unique capacities of London was that someone was able to disappear within a short distance. With its ever-growing bustle, the fluid movements of people, and its growing populations that saw a rise from 400,000 in 1650 to nearly 1 million by 1800, it meant that over shorter distances, anyone could disappear over really short distances. Hence, for Sabina, the distance was only 2 miles from the river from where she ran to potentially Whitechapel, where she disappeared to. So the advertisement in itself gives us a broad understanding of where Sabina went, but we cannot know exactly where her journey began or where she ended up. And so I'm taking some creative license here, blending the imagination with the historical to flesh out this history. And in this talk, we can begin to envision the day that she ran, taking one of many possible routes from the river in further into Tower Hamlets. And with it, I want to imagine the other people of African heritage who occupied the same geographies either in the years before her flight or the years after, who shared the same path and tell the story of African people in Tower Hamlets. And so there's many possible ways that this story could have begun. It could have started in Billingsgate, in Shadwell, in Rotherhithe, all were places of trade and distribution. However, the ship logs for the ship, the Hannah, didn't specify which dock the ships stowed in. And so I have decided or specified that Sabina may have fled from Wapping, as many others definitely did. The fact that others did, and that there is more evidence of this, gives us some important impressions on the role that the Wapping docks had in the system of slavery. For example, fleeing from a ship. There were other examples of runaway advertisements of individuals who fled from ships. One example is Isaac, who fled off the ship the Mermaid, which was lying off Old Wapping Stairs on the 1st of July in 1764. And you can see that represented in this map here. It's just the middle dock indicated on the riverside there. And the same, similarly, Joe and Chaptank were fled from the ship, the Planters of Friendship, also lying in Wapping Old Stairs Dock on the 16th of May, 1744, less than a year after Sabina's flight. Joe was said to be well-shaped and slender and had been shot through the thigh with a musket ball, indicating that if this injury indicating that it may have been a result of his flight and proving how dangerous such attempts could be. But more tellingly, from the ship, the Andrew, also off Wapping Old Stairs, there was a man specified as sorry, I should specify that this talk will have sort of racialized language and racist language that is no longer acceptable, but I'm going to be quoting here. Quote, a Negro man slave named Jack or John Leslie, or now by the name of Butler, who fled from that ship on the 12th of October, 1766. He was said to have been 5 feet and 7 inches and said to have worn his own wool or hair on his head when he left the ship. Now, this particular example, the explicit statement of enslavement stated that despite the typically ambiguous language used in these runaway advertisements, these were experiences of enslavement or re-enslavement, particularly concerning those in contact with ships at the Wapping docks. And this example, and these examples more broadly, elevate the importance of the practice and the system of slavery, not only through its active slavery practices, but also as a place where liberated persons were reported to be or to be returned to. And so this was also a place of not only just active enslavement, but this was a place of kind of recollections. There were about 13 other runaway advertisements requesting information or for the liberated African to be returned to ships, taverns, or people in or near Wapping Old Stairs, Wapping New Stairs, or Union Stairs Wapping, which were all docks along the Wapping riverside, indicating that, again, Wapping was another significant place for not only kind of the active re-enslavement of individuals on ships, but also in terms of the local businesses and the local individuals who were actively involved in the slavery system. And then at the same time as this, there were also deaths at the dock that were suggestive. As an increasingly congested region, the Pool of London could be dangerous. From 1792, it managed 65% of the imports and exports for all of England, and the port itself held 3,663 ships in 1792, which was up from 1,000 in 1751. Despite its capacity for only 545 ships, it required large amounts of people to manage and support this influx, resulting in damaged goods, delays, thefts, and even deaths. One such example was a man called Dublin, who was described as a black man who drowned on Wapping Old Stairs in November 1757, and another man who was just recorded as an unknown black man drowned at the dock, also in Wapping, and was buried at St John Wapping in 1783, just on the riverside there. Is also represented in this map here. These deaths may have occurred for a number of reasons. It could have been an accident, or it could have been for many other reasons. Still, when considering in this conversation of enslavement and freedom, the cause of their deaths may speculate on more racialized reasons for these deaths. Perhaps, like many of their brothers and sisters on the Middle Passage, these men who lacked surnames or even known names chose death rather than the fate that could have waited them stowed on the ships in Wapping, or died in the attempt of flight. Death, or the risk of death here, was perhaps deemed either a necessary choice or a worthwhile risk to escape bondage. Trade in the Pool of London often drew working people in as a space of regular but casual work, or for men as an opportunity to begin, or as an opportunity, or being conscripted to sail away as mariners. But the line of the dock against the north side of the riverbank also posed a threat to some black lives, with some ships becoming prisons, both in their containment of people waiting to be displaced, but in the minds of those captured on board, and who reckon with the reality of this captivity that awaited them when they would next step off that boat. For Sabina, however, this reality was shifted with her flight, for she was, and again I quote, deluded away by some other black. And so this area shows thus a kind of high population of African people, that it was a space to work for Black people as well as a potential area of threat. It was a multicultural space. African, East and Southeast Asian people were often recorded in this area, so much so that John Fielding stated in 1776, when one goes to Rotherhithe or Wapping, which are places inhabited chiefly by sailors, but that somewhat of the same language is spoken, one man would be apt to suspect himself in another country. Their manners of living, speaking, acting, dressing, and behaving are very peculiar to themselves. And so we can see this as an area of kind of budding multicultural space, because this was an area of consistent connection with the empire, which was constantly flowing in people, labor, resources from all across the world. And so it's expected to find the multicultural community that we do find in the Wapping and across the river. But this was also a place where men scoured the area for kind of supporting other Black people, as there were 4 cases of people being, and again I quote, deluded away by other Black people. So perhaps amongst the people and workers on the docks, there were lookouts, soldiers in solidarity who sought to liberate Africans on these ships that were well-known slavers in the docks. But in any case, we can see an increasing presence of Black people. For example, one Francis Frost was a mariner who lived in Blackjack Alley in Wapping with his wife Hannah, whom he married on the 21st of October 1725, and had a son, Samuel Frost, who was baptized in St John Wapping. He was one of a comparatively few number of Black mariners recorded in St John Wapping's parish records, compared to other regions like Shadwell or Limehouse, where there was a much larger number of Black mariners and Black people recorded in the parishes. And so perhaps this is also again suggestive of the significance of Wapping in the slavery system. But increasingly, there was a strong Black population by the river. The American migrations after the American Revolution resulted in thousands of Black loyalists who had shown support for the British and been given their freedom through the Dunmore Proclamation, moving from American states to Nova Scotia and to Britain. And equally, the end of the slave trade, which is sort of also encompassed in this period, saw or may have seen a change in a Black person's relationship to the river. For example, there is a lighterman who, and the role was to transport cargo from the merchant ships to the docks or to the shore. And one particular lighterman, Samuel Creighton, in 1824, who was the son of William Fernandez, the king of Bongo country as it was recorded, but we know it as Gabon, who at 16 was baptized in Poplar, and who years later became a lighterman. And he became a lighterman in Poplar, but remained in Poplar, marrying a woman called Elizabeth and having a son who shared his name called Samuel. But see, we in this example, we see Black people having a different relationship to the river than maybe their predecessors may have done years before. Increasingly, numbers of Black mariners are recorded in the 19th century, alluding to a shift not just the recording and the record keeping of materials, but also in the relationship between Black men, London's ports, and ships more broadly. The docks would not only represent this work or this reality of enslavement entirely for Black people, nor would it remain that way. Black people would share in the opportunities and the networks that working at the docks provided by the 19th century. Missionary Joseph Salter, said how in East London, he describes an occasion when 50 Africans were on the dockside forming a circle around two musicians. One had a guitar of a homely manufacture, quote, with 3 strings and the hard shell of fruits they called the zizi. The instruments on the other were extemporized, be made by thrusting a stout bamboo through a disused bully tin, on the side of which the dark musicians kept beating a marrow bone. To this music, the Africans joined chorus and sprang about. End of quote. Beyond the patronizing tone, Salter observes the integration of African culture, music, and dance into London's everyday spaces through actions of communion and through expression. And so the docks would be a really significant place. And I think I've kind of spoken quite a lot about that for the minute. But if we're going back to Sabina, and kind of you can see with the red arrows pointing in the direction of flow that I imagine her journey taking, we can see her fleeing from the docks in Wapping and making her way towards Rags Fair. She likely would have found herself on Wapping High Street, running past warehouses and taverns, perhaps breathing in the yeasty scents of the brew houses, evading the watermen or the dock workers. In so doing, she would have passed St. John Wapping, where Samuel Frost, the son of Francis Frost, was baptized nearly 20 years earlier. And before that, where the Grigg family were baptized between 1706 and 1707. Starting on the 18th of November 1706, Anne Grigg of Barbados, aged 30, was baptized. She was recorded as already married to Thomas Grigg. Whilst there's no record of their marriage, it is possible that Thomas Grigg was a mariner and they married abroad and moved to London. On the same day, their daughters, Phoebe, aged 10, and then Elizabeth, who was born the year before, were both baptized. A year later, in 1707, their youngest daughter, Anne, was born and baptized on the 8th of July, 1707. Thomas, as a mariner, made it less surprising that the family were recorded in a parish in Wapping. All around the area, the tenement were filled with wives and widows of sailors and seamen who sought to be close by when their husbands returned from sea, or invariably did not. Interestingly, though, the family travelled from Parrot Alley, which at the time of the baptism was just off East Smithfield, by the Exchange, to St. John Wapping to be baptized. And whilst we cannot know the reasoning for this, the Griggs take almost the reverse trip of Sabina, moving into Wapping for religious sanctification through the act of baptism and the social support that being baptized into a parish and becoming eligible for settlement and status and welfare would mean. What is definitively known is that as a result of the records of births, marriages, and deaths, like Frances Frost or like the Griggs, we can observe the formation of Black and interracial families in Wapping. Moreover, we can see their evolution over time, sometimes in saddening ways. Mortality rates were really high in this period, particularly for children, due to the poor living conditions, disease, and malnutrition. 350 to 400,000 of every 1,000 infants were dying by the mid-18th century. Therefore, it was a tragically common reality for children to die young, like Elizabeth, the second daughter of Anne and Thomas Grigg, who at age 11 died of consumption and was buried in St John Wapping. In her burial record, she's listed as poor, contextualizing her early deaths and also the struggles of lower socioeconomic families, a struggle that would have impacted working families regardless of race. And so we passed the story through kind of St John Wapping, we pass on the stories of many Black families who were baptized. But Sabina would have kept running west. She would have seen St John Wapping in passing, and she may have run all the way up to Wapping High Street, following the road round to Little Hermitage Street, passing the docks, warehouses, and more breweries, and up onto Nightingale Lane, now known as Thomas More Street, running all the way up to East Smithfield. Sabina, on Nightingale Lane, had she been on that street 3 years later, may have encountered Thomas Neptune, a quote, Negro servant to Captain Francis Mitchelson, aged 27, end quote, who was baptized in St. Mary Whitechapel on 1746. Lots of captains and baptisms of captains show the residence of captains in East London and by extension highlight their Black servants. Black servants from international travels or not indicate in these baptism records indicate the preference for Black servants and using Black servants perhaps as an ornamental status symbol, dressed in bold colours and lavish liveries to exemplify their exoticness. But equally, they also may have used them in the context of their own enslavement. And so, but these may not necessarily have been explicitly stated in the records themselves. In any case, if Sabina had been on that street, she may have encountered Thomas Neptune, but she kept on running. And many years later, on this same street, Nightingale Lane, in 1778, a 25-year-old Charlotte Gardner was said to have escaped her enslaver, James Moore, in New York and fled to London and become a sex worker in a noted house of ill fame on Black Horse Yard, just off of Nightingale Lane. Now, in this period, millions of Africans, Indians, Chinese, and Pacific Islanders had moved into Europe to provide labor for European colonial powers, and in London sought sexual services. And whilst they would have diversified the clientele of this, the sex industry also was diversified in its workers through the same migration, with more African, Asian, and women of other ethnic groups participating in sex work. Now, Thomas Neptune and Charlotte Gardner show how, within these records, both the enslaved, the formerly enslaved, and the employed Black person assume seamlessly embedded into the East End, appearing alongside other residents and locals, utilizing the lack of social policy or legally overarching laws that restricted the participation of Black people in London society. Even slavery wasn't legally codified into law, although Sabina's, Jack's, Joe, and Shaptank's lives show its active practice in London. Gardner also indicates the possibilities of women like Sabina to have lives after their liberation. After her own liberation, Charlotte became a sex worker in the region or nearby, likely where she arrived. Now, this is something characteristic of what we see of American migrants, who often remained in the communities in the East End, close to the London docks from the disembarkment. But whilst Charlotte was liberated, She entered a gendered labour market that saw very limited job opportunities for women more broadly, ranging from domestic service to casual labour. Work that was poorly paid, seasonal, competitive, and did not always provide enough for women to survive. Hence, 1 in 5 women in London worked or supplemented their wages using sex work. She entered sex work in the east of London, which often operated by the docks or in the districts like Whitechapel, Wapping, or Shadwell, catering to lower economic status clientele, such as sailors, and these were areas that lacked wealthy patrons. So, sex work often operated with less of an attraction, occupying poorer quarters, lanes, or courts that contrast completely to the west of London, where it had a lot more kind of grandeur and a lot more visibility. Now, Charlotte sadly was executed during the Gordon riots in June 1780. And her story was that she was convicted of harrying a crowd in during the riots and leading to the destruction of a man's house in St. Catherine's Lane. And so she was taken to the Old Bailey, found guilty, and executed. As a number of Black people, but also a larger portion of people who were involved in the Gordon riots. The riots themselves were in response to new reforms for Catholic people in London, which were met with hostilities by the Protestant movements. And so it's a sad kind of devastatingly real story of how liberation may have liberated Charlotte from enslavement, but also exposed her to the very real realities of life on the streets of London. But equally, how Black people were engaging in sort of the social, the political, and the religious changes and politics of the time, and the difficulties of navigating a labour market. Indeed, freedom came both with the dangers of poverty, disease, crime, and life on the streets, and situated Sabina in this very same situation. One advantage in acquiring work, though, is that Black women being deemed the cheaper servant and thus often more popular with single women or with widows, gave them some opportunity or some means of competing in the market. And so there was an example of Mary Mason, who was, quote, a Negro servant to Mrs. Waters in Prince's Square in Stepney, and was said to be about 40 years old, end of quote. And she was baptized in St. George in the East on the 12th of April, 1751. Now, her mistress, Hannah Waters, had become a widow in 1748 when her husband, John, died. Without any children, Hannah inherited the marital home on Prince's Square, and Mason remained her servant for the rest of those years until Hannah died later in 1751. Then meaning that Mary Mason was equally put in the precarious position of entering the labour market once more, but she did have some job security alongside Hannah Waters and working with her. A little higher up the road on the image on the left, we can see Sabina potentially moving into East Smithfield, where Mary Phyllis was a Black woman, or was quoted as a blackamoor, who was 20 years old and dwelling with Millicent Porter, a seamaster was baptized in Aldgate on the 3rd of June, 1597. And she was described as a Black woman who was of a Morosco, whose father was Phyllis of Morosco, which is a word used to describe converted Christians in the Iberian world who converted from Islam to Catholicism. And she was said to have been in England for 13 to 14 years and not been christened, but having become the servant to Millicent Porter in East Smithfield, was now of her Christian faith and desired to become a Christian. And so we see other examples of Black women right the way back until the Tudor period who who were engaging with the same practice and living in these same spaces. Now, if Sabina had run as far, was running to Rags Fair, she would have to continue on. Past East Smithfield, passing Parrot Alley, where the Griggs lived 40 years before, to Rags Fair, the market where you did not need money, but you could actually barter old clothes and items without money. It drew in many of London's poor, seeking opportunities to find, exchange, or sell the little they had to support themselves when money was tight. Rags Fair spread out from one point, from sort of this earlier kind of the end of Smithfield, right the way across Rosemary Lane, which is, you can sort of see in the image on the right, now Royal Mint Street. And Alexander Pope described, oh, gone too far, go back. Alexander Pope described that Rosemary Lane was a heathenist part of town, distinguished, as we found, by inquiry, with an applicable title of knock barges adjacent to savoury places, which, in ridicule of vagrant fumes at the arise of the musty, rotten rags and burnt old shoes, is called by the sweet name Rosemary Lane. And it was said to have been open every day between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon till the night, where anyone could come to sell their old apparel and resell their commodities to merchants, to brokers, and anyone who kind of was operating shops and old stalls in these streets. So this street would have been lined with clothes shops and stalls. And despite the sort of den-like description, the Rags Fair or Rosemary Lane would have been the ideal place for Sabina to start again, not only bartering the little she had to find food, a place to stay, work, or clothes, but it was a place where the poor could come to when they did not have anything, and the clothes on their back and the few effects that they had could be valued as money to even save their lives. But Sabina's journey may not have even stopped there, for if she may have gone all the way up to Whitechapel via White Lion Street. And if in so doing, she would have passed the London Infirmary, where Hercules fled from his enslavement on the 19th of July, 1750, according to a runaway advertisement about him. Alone, Sabina and Hercules' notices depict individual stories of flight intersecting into these same streets. Yet, through Hercules' enslaver, Cleveland, Captain Cleveland, opens up our awareness to how spread out and how interconnected enslaved Black lives could be through the experiences of enslavement in the private home. For earlier that year, in January 1750, Captain William Cleveland had a son called William Cleveland, and the son was baptized in St. George in the East at 15 days after his birth. His mother was only noted as, quote, a Negro slave, end of quote. Tax records situate Cleveland in the houses in Stepney from 1749, where he had recently returned from America. It's possible that Cleveland, upon returning to London, brought with him a number of enslaved persons, including his son's mother and Hercules, affirming the likelihood that Hercules was also enslaved. Hence, the story of one runaway, contextualized across the sources, draws our attention to a household of enslaved persons, a story that then extends to multiple sites across Tower Hamlets. And the trail indicates, and Sabina's trail not only offers a knowledge of people, but also places. For running past White Lion Street, up Lemon Street, and past Goodman Fields and Red Lion Street, you end up at the site of an old Elizabethan theatre, but may have also been the site of the White Raven Tavern, where 43 years after Sabina's flight, the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor had set up a station to offer the relief of poor Black people who had signed up for the Sierra Leone Resettlement Project, a project designed to alleviate the issues of the Black poor in London by relocating them to Sierra Leone. cues from the over 700 Black people who had signed up for the project arrived between 1786 and 1787, right around the corner from Whitechapel Road. From here, amongst a street of weavers, brewers, and the Jewish and French Huguenot communities that made up this area, the trail of Sabina turns cold. We do not know if this was her final destination, if she even went to Whitechapel, or if she went further than this. But from Whitechapel, the trail of others can be picked up. For example, there's one individual, William Thompson, who's, quote, a Negro, end of quote, before called Julius Caesar, who's aged about 40 years old and living on Mansell Street, only a few months after Sabina's flight, and was baptized on the 10th of March, 1744, in St. Mary, Whitechapel. The presence of his former name, a classical name often forced upon enslaved persons to ridicule them and to mark them their enslavement, possibly alludes to the historic experience of William's enslavement. With his own name, William Thompson, William signals the possibility for Sabina to begin again in Whitechapel with a new found liberty. And so, one thing I really wanted to emphasize, I'm going to sort of draw this trail to a close. And what I wanted to highlight in this, by traveling the winding trail of Sabina and following in what may have been her footsteps into Tower Hamlets on a journey that spanned less than 2 miles, is that she passed many ghosts of a wide range of other people of African heritage. Moreover, she too formed a part of a memory for the future of African people in the East End, an ever-developing population. Examining the lives of people of African heritage is to observe the full breadth of life in the East End, encompassing the stories of working people that was shared across the city. They worked, they lived, they communed, and they survived, immersed in this multiracial geography. But within the breadth are also the underrepresented aspects of London life, shaped by the racialized experiences of enslavement, recapture, racial capitalism, and liberation that expand the contexts of freedom and unfreedom in London beyond that of indenture or in lingering feudal practice. On the trail, what I've tried to point out here is, one of the many trails that Sabina may have taken, but with nearly 1,000 individuals to examine, we can be assured that every one of these possible routes bears the presence of other African lives. And so there's so much more work to be done and many more stories to be told. But in all of this, there is rich and telling information to uncover about the people of African heritage that lived in the East End over the early modern period. Thank you very much for listening.